Hi everyone and welcome. We've just got started. We've got a few people still waiting to get in, so we're just going to give it a minute or two and then we'll get cracking. So thank you for joining promptly. Okay, welcome everybody. As I say, we've still got a few people joining, so we'll just let them join when they're ready. Thanks to everyone for taking time out of your busy day to join us today. And welcome to our Public Services webinar. Now this is organised by the STUC, but it's in partnership with a couple of our organisations we've been working closely with around these areas. One is Tax Justice Scotland and the other is the Wellbeing Economy Strategy Group. So I'm Linda Somerville and I'm the Deputy General Secretary here at the STUC. And as most of you will know, we are Scotland's trade union centre and we represent more than 550,000 trade union members across Scotland. So I'd like to say that for the partners that are working with us on the webinar today, as I say, it's the Scottish Wellbeing Economy Strategy Group, and they include members from the STUC, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance Scotland, Friends of the Earth Scotland, the People's Health Movement Scotland, and academics from the University of Glasgow. And Tax Justice Scotland, who are backed by a diverse range of civic organisations, think tanks, trade unions, economists and academics who are all united in their mission to create a fairer Scottish tax system. So we wanted to organise this webinar really as in the lead up to the election to highlight and discuss some of the key issues that we think political parties need to consider ahead of the upcoming election. We can all sometimes be a bit distracted by some of the smaller parts of manifestos that grab the headlights, and indeed some of the things that maybe the media think that they want to concentrate on around candidates, when in fact we know that there are some really core issues that Scottish Government has to deal with in the future, particularly around public services and how they're going to make them work for Scotland for a really changing dynamic in our population in terms of the demographic, the different types of services that people are going to need in the future. And Scottish Government does have the power to do a lot of work in this area, and some of the decisions they make and how they interact with local authorities will be key to how our services are delivered going forward. So we wanted to try and use this webinar to inform people about some of the key asks that we've got, to hear from some of the experts in the area to discuss the issues, and really to equip you with some of the knowledge and information you might need to take this back to your own members and also to lobby your own candidates locally, and we'll come back to that at the end. So we know that our public services are really crucial to tackling poverty and providing the foundations that we need in Scotland for people to live a good life. But they really are at breaking point, and anyone who works in public services will tell you that. Everyone's trying to do more with less, and a lot of people have moved on for different reasons, and it's always the people that are left behind trying to deliver that are really left trying to pull everything together. Austerity, the pandemic and the cost of living crisis are all putting a huge strain on this demand. And politicians have come to this from different ideologies and backgrounds and experiences about how they think they might want to solve the problem. But ultimately, we would argue that those that work in public services are the ones that probably have the best ideas in this area. So we wanted a key focus of our manifesto, which we published last week, was on the question of public services, how they're funded and delivered, and in whose interests they're run. And to discuss this today, we've got a great lineup of speakers to consider these issues further. With us today, we've got Lillian Macer, who is the Scottish Secretary of Unison, Stephen Boyd, the Director of IPPR Scotland, Andy Mudd, a consultant working with the Association of Public Services Excellence, and Laurie McFarlane, Co-Director of Future Economy Scotland. So I'm going to ask all of our panel to do maybe up to 5-7 minutes at the most presentation, and then we'll open up for a Q&A, and we will hope plan to finish at 1:30 today. I'd really encourage you to take some notes and think about what our speakers are saying, and we'll be taking some questions as well if you want to post them in the Q&A function on the top of your screen. It's the first time that we've just started this week using Microsoft Teams for our webinars, so forgive us if we get any technical problems, but we're pretty sure we're going to be okay. And as I say, I just encourage you to think about the questions that you want, and we'll take them after we've heard from our speakers. So with that, I'm now going to introduce our first speaker, Lillian Macer, the Scottish Secretary of Unison. Over to you, Lillian.
Linda, thanks very much. And again, my thanks to colleagues who have given up your lunchtime to join this webinar. For me, critically important. We know that across Scotland, people rely on services that educate our children, care for our loved ones, and protect public health and keep our communities safe. Now, these are not services that are abstract concepts. These are services that are delivered by people, skilled, committed public sector workers whose experience and dedication underpins a fairer Scotland. Yet for far too long, the debate about public services has been reduced to slogans and to false choices. Some politicians saying there is no money to improve our public services, and others saying that there will be ample digital solutions that can replace people, that we can cut millions from corporate costs without consequences to our services, and that we are told that job cuts can be done through natural attrition with minimal impact on world-class public services. And these services can be achieved, and some would say, by simply taxing the rich. Colleagues, we can't sleepwalk into this election without having an honest debate about public services. Scotland needs an honest national conversation about the future of public services, what we can expect from our public services, and what changes that we need to put in place, and critically, how we can fund and who pays for those services. And the latest Scottish Government budget promises to cut 15,000 jobs from the service, removing £1.4 billion from public services over the next 3 years. And the justification for that, the claims that have been made, back office roles can go without any impact on frontline services, and frontline services will be protected. So it's not just Unison that thinks that this is unrealistic, dangerous, and totally disconnected from reality. Stephen Boyd, who's on this call this afternoon, will go into more detail from IPPR Scotland, but they also argue that the plans, the SNP plans right now around public services reforms are built on flawed assumptions. So, and I know Stephen will go into more detail around that. And the SNP want to shrink public services, and right now Reform are out there saying that they will attack public sector pensions. And we're not hearing anything from any other political party on what they will do differently. And we know that constant changing needs require constant changing services, and we're not averse to having debate about how those services can be changed. But those changing services need to see improvement, and should not be around managing decline and cannot be code for cuts. Right now, Scotland has the longest NHS waiting times since devolution. Social care services are in crisis. Jobs are being cut in police services. And Scotland's councils are warning that they're in danger of becoming financially unsustainable. So we need a Scottish Parliament that uses its powers to invest in the long term. This means properly funding our public services, looking at intervention and preventing costly crisis, resourcing children's services, meeting the additional needs support requirements through schools, delivering the NHS workforce planning that matches the rising demand and bring down those waiting times, and also fixing low pay, the single biggest barrier to resolving the crisis in care and ending delayed discharges. Unison's manifesto that we launched a week past Saturday is grounded in our members' lived experience. Thousands of workers across public services reflecting what staff see in the ground. Services stretched to the limit, workforces under pressure, a growing gap between political rhetoric and everyday reality. The Scottish Government's own public sector reform strategy, published in June last year, promises that services will be more effective, more efficient, and fiscally sustainable, embedding a culture of continuous improvement and collaboration across the system. But what are we seeing? A managed decline. Workforce trajectories of 0.5% per annum until 2029-2030 is and should be called out as a political choice that could have devastating consequences for those who rely on it. And as the public sector union Unison, we have a significant contribution to make in this debate. We have extensive evidence of what works because we represent over 160,000 members across Scotland. Our members understand better than anyone what systems they use. They understand better than anyone where they could be improved and how services that need to change could change for the better. And the lack of investment in our public services and the people that rely on them is a matter of life and death and should not be used as a political football or political grandstanding. Needs to stop. The detail in Unison's manifesto gives us a clear choice. Investing in public services and allowing our members to deliver high quality public services for the population of Scotland is the right direction. And we know that public services at the heart of a fairer Scotland delivers for the population in Scotland. Colleagues, thanks very much for listening. I really do look forward to the Q&A at the end of this.
Thank you, Lillian, and thanks for giving us an overview there of where Unison's position is. I think the important things as well, and I'm glad you touched on it, around false choices, because we're often told that there either has to be, a less of a back office workforce as if they're somehow dispensable and have no implications for what frontline services there are. So I think that that's a real false dichotomy that's often presented to people as well around dividing the workforce and some idea that there's this, machine behind that can just kind of have bits of it taken out. You mentioned public service reform as well, and I know we'll come on to that through our other speakers. The Scottish Government are very keen to look at reforms, but I mean, we've been arguing with them as well around the fact that we can't even begin to talk about reforming lots of parts of public services while they're still in recovery, both in terms of the workforce planning, some of the efficiencies that there are that people have identified that could be done, that unions have identified, and that actually haven't been implemented as well. So their idea of reform is probably quite different to how workers would see it, when we think that services are probably still in recovery, a lot of them, both social care and the NHS, since the pandemic particularly. I'll move on to our next speaker now, and I'd like to invite Stephen Boyd, who's the Director of IPPR. So over to you now, Stephen.
Thanks, Linda, and thanks for the invitation to join you today. It's great to see. Just like yesterday, it's great to see so many old friends on the call. So I'm going to try and use my 5 minutes here to briefly summarise the analysis and the main findings of a report, More for Less: Employment Productivity and Reform in the Scottish Public Services, that we published last week. I've just posted the link in the chat, and I'd also draw your attention to a series of related blogs that are on our website. But just to quickly, it's a 30-page report, so I'm not going to be able to summarise it all in 5 minutes. But first, to say a wee bit about context. So as things stand, the gap between the Scottish Government spending commitments and its revenues is going to reach 4.7 billion by 2029-30. The recent Scottish Government spending review confirms that real-term spending cuts across local government, justice and home affairs, and education and skills portfolios between this year and 2028-29. So that's real-term spending cuts already planned for the coming period, and I think that's kind of been quite often overlooked. And the health and social care portfolio might be relatively protected, but the 2% increase per year it will receive is less than the 3.3% that the Scottish Government told us last year was required simply to keep up with demand. So this is clearly a very serious situation. I don't think it does anyone any favours to pretend otherwise. But the problem is that the current debate is very far from serious, and witness the two manifestos that have been published so far for the Scottish election, the Tory and Reform manifesto. So both will make very heroic assumptions of potential efficiencies from abolishing or consolidating public bodies. They're clearly less than specific about what these consolidations might look like, but the gains, they're assuming huge gains that they also assume will be easily achieved. And we would argue that they're wrong on both counts. Any potential gains are highly uncertain and almost certainly an order of magnitude smaller than what they assume, and even these will be difficult to achieve, at least without a seriously detrimental impact on the level and quality of services. So Lillian just touched on the current Scottish Government's policy framework for public service reform, but I'll maybe just say a wee bit more about that. At the end of last year, the Scottish Government published two papers almost simultaneously, the Public Service Reform Strategy and the Fiscal Sustainability Delivery Plan. But despite being published almost simultaneously, the strategies failed to provide a coherent and credible framework for pursuing effective reform. Indeed, they often seem to pull in different directions. So regarding the target that Lillian mentioned, the delivery plan introduces a target to reduce public sector employment by 0.5% per year to 2029-30. The target's not included in the reform strategy, and there's no plan to meet the target beyond a ministerial statement given to Parliament, which suggested that the reductions to be achieved through natural attrition and recruitment controls. So the approach is unashamedly non-strategic. There is no effort made to align resources with priorities, which is a really, really poor starting point for effective reform. Instead, it is just a target simply introduced to meet budgetary imperatives. And we need to remember the 0.5% targets across the whole of the public sector. So if frontline services are to be protected, and by this we're assuming they mean NHS care, teachers, police and firefighters, a much bigger proportionate cut to the non-frontline sector will be necessary. So our analysis suggests that non-frontline areas could face staffing cuts of between 3 to 3.5% per year, or a drop of about 13% by 2029-30, amounted to around about 20,000 jobs. The IFS, I think, estimates about 18,000 jobs, so it's absolutely in the same ballpark area. And both these strategies together fail to set out anything approaching a credible plan for managing this scale of job losses over that time period. But a report also had a look at whether the persistent claims, and you hear them almost on a daily basis at the moment, that the devolved public sector is bloated, have any validity. Will probably not surprise you to find that we concluded that they do not, and for a number of reasons. The employment in Scottish public services is higher than England, but it's not high by international standards. And indeed, the UK reduced public sector employment more than any other OECD nation in the 2010s. There's also a pretty obvious apples and oranges problem here, in that private providers play a much smaller role in delivering NHS services in Scotland than they do in England. And Scotland's publicly owned water and ferry companies do not have analogues in other parts of the UK. We're just not comparing like with like. Yes, the public sector workforce has grown in recent years, particularly in the NHS and the civil service, but this largely reflects pressures of demographic change and the transfer of responsibilities from the EU to the Scottish Government following Brexit. The median wage in the Scottish public sector is indeed higher than it is in England, but in real terms it remains below pre-austerity levels. So the median public sector wage in Scotland in 2026 is lower than it was in 2010 when you account for inflation. But the key point for us is that because the wage is even lower in other parts of the UK, it really doesn't represent anything like a coherent and compelling argument that it's excessive in Scotland. We also hear our current Minister, Ivan McGee, who leads on public service reform. We hear him being very ambitious in terms of what productivity increases might bring to the party here, and they might, in and of themselves, fill that fiscal gap. We regard this as being highly unlikely, to put it mildly. So we need to remember that public services are intrinsically people-driven services in which productivity growth can be expected to lag behind that for the whole economy, given that technological improvements tend to complement rather than substitute for labour. And this is one of these kind of happy areas where economic theory is in line with empirical evidence. There's not many of them, but if you look across all countries at all times, the kind of services delivered by the Scottish public sector show a rate of productivity growth well below that for the economy as a whole. And this is the fundamental reason why comparing public to private sector productivity makes no sense. The private sector contains highly capital intensive sectors in which productivity tends to increase relatively rapidly. So comparing productivity increases in the public sector only to labour intensive services in the private sector yields very different outcomes. For instance, hairdressing finds it very difficult to increase productivity. So we would argue that politicians should be very wary of assuming that rapid and sustainable productivity increases will enhance service quality and reduce costs over the timescale that we're concerned about here. So we hear a lot, again, almost on a daily basis, about the potential for AI and other technologies and to drive productivity growth. We, again, very, very sceptical. These are intrinsically people-driven services, and if you remove the people from delivery, then you're going to reduce the quality of the service provided. And unless technology substitutes for people, it removes them from their roles and performs that role completely, then it won't add to, it won't reduce costs. And we can see this is how things have played out in health over a longer term. Technology has clearly had a massive impact on how health services are delivered and the outcomes they achieve, but the evidence is pretty clear. It increases costs through the cost of purchasing equipment and added demand. When you introduce new treatments, people want them. So health just isn't like manufacturing industry where we can expect technology to reduce costs. So quickly, in conclusion, none of the above is to argue that Scottish public services can't change and improve, and indeed we've got a reasonable idea of what works, and Lillian alluded to that. But much of that will require upfront investment and or radically devolving responsibility to those who deliver services, and neither of these are included in the current Scottish Government's plans. Yes, there are real pressures in public finances, but whether the costs of fiscal consolidation are borne by those who deliver or rely most on public services or are distributed across the whole population via taxes is a political decision. The truth is that successful reform, improving access and standards while maintaining or lowering costs will be difficult to achieve and sustain. The failure to implement the proposals of the Christie Commission 2011, we need to remember, and the future delivery of public services points to the scale of the challenge. Progress has been glacial despite Christie's proposals, enjoying a level of consensus that's highly unusual in Scottish society. I fear I've went over my allotted time already, Linda, so I will stop there and more than happy to come back to anything else in questions.
Thank you, Stephen. I mean, you've given us a great overview of your, as you say, your really comprehensive document as well. I mean, I think some of the points that you made there about how the government not only has contradicted its own estimates of what's needed when they've looked at, saying that some budgets are potentially protected, but previously they'd said that they needed more, but also this complexity that government has around different strategies that they're pulling out and how they actually sometimes don't complement each other at all, but they can actually be going in different directions. And I think we've seen that quite a lot with the last 4 or 5 years of this government, where particularly parts of government that are much more interested in enterprise and productivity have been driving a very different agenda to the other parts of government that are thinking much more widely about welfare, well-being, or indeed fair work. So, you know, that tension does exist, but it's quite right that we are the people that point that out. And also thank you for breaking down some of the stuff about productivity. I think that that's occasionally people shy away from that because they think, well, you know, we can't really answer that. You know, yes, we should be more productive, but how do you measure productivity in that sense of what we're actually doing for work? Because, you know, thankfully, we're not all just collecting widgets or producing widgets, you know, so thanks for that as well. I'll move on, and our next speaker is Andy Mudd, and as I say, Andy Mudd is a consultant who specialises around public services excellence and has been doing a lot of work on outsourcing as well. So over to you, Andy. Thanks.
Thanks, Linda. Good afternoon, everybody. Last year we did some work for the STCU looking at the cost of outsourcing. As a result, I can tell you that Scottish public bodies spend about £16 billion a year with non-public sector suppliers out of a total spend of about 111 billion. Unfortunately, what I can't do is tell you with any degree of accuracy how that breaks down between contracted out services and other expenditure. That's because different bodies collect data in totally different ways. Many of them just don't differentiate between one category and another. What we do know from that work is that outsourcing of services is still on the increase in Scotland. 4 out of every £1 the government spends on procurement relates to the NHS. That includes a growing proportion on spending on residential care, GP contract and primary care contractor payments, NHS bank and agency staff, cleaning, catering, facilities management, outsourced maintenance, capital projects, specialist and diagnostic services procured privately. Spending on agency and bank staff more than doubled between 2019 and 2023. For councils, data from Glasgow Council, which does separate external spending to goods, services and works, shows that Glasgow City Council holds current contracts with a combined value of 2.2 billion. Service contracts make up about 1.4 billion of that. In 2024-25, the authority spent 445 million on external service provision. That's risen from 355 million in 2021, a 25% increase over the 4 years. I mean, the question is, why do public bodies outsource and why do they continue to do so? I mean, on the face of it, outsourcing should be more expensive than direct services, if only because the proportion of what's paid goes to profit. It also goes to more expensive debt and a range of other ways that private companies extract money from the public sector. The data suggests that for social care, that can be 20% or more of the total amount paid. So why do it? The answer, of course, is that competition's supposed to guarantee best price. That was the rationale behind compulsory competitive tendering in the 1980s, and it's still the rationale. How far it's true is debatable. Either way, though, public services are highly labour intensive. That means that competition inevitably means competing on staff costs. Outsourcing is all about cutting the cost of mostly frontline staff. But if 20% of the money goes as profit, etc., that means that staff costs would have to be cut by more than 20% to deliver savings. In fact, taking account of pay and pensions, privately employed public sector care workers do cost around 20% less than their directly employed colleagues. That leaves little room for savings, which goes a long way to explain why, after 50 years of contracting out and privatisation, the UK state actually spends more as a proportion of GDP than it did in the 1970s. The only category of expenditure that's fallen during that time is that of defence. Public revenue, taxation to you and me, is currently around 39% of GDP, having been 40% in 1950 and 33% in 1973. On its own terms then, marketisation and privatisation have not reduced the cost of public services nor the size of the state. What has happened is that the burden of paying for it has shifted from those with the broadest shoulders onto everybody else's. Hence the so-called squeezed middle that Gordon Brown talked about, where people pay more but seem to get less. Meantime, outsourced public service workers earn less and have inferior pensions, with the saving transferring more or less directly to the owners, investors and lenders of the private companies that employ them. Many of those are increasingly based overseas, often in tax havens, so pay little if any tax in the UK. The workforce bears the brunt of the cost of outsourcing, but local economies also pay a price when money that care workers and others would otherwise spend in local shops goes out of the area and in many cases out of Scotland and out of the UK. Moreover, lower pay and pensions equals more reliance on benefits, other drains on the public purse associated with poverty. The tragic impact on children growing up in poverty is well documented. It's one reason why social mobility has gradually ground to a halt over the last 50 years. And let us not forget that frontline public service jobs are predominantly performed by women, and also that black and minority ethnic groups are overrepresented in those roles. Outsourcing therefore disproportionately affects women and black and minority ethnic groups. Whether or not there's a legal route to challenge the inherent unfairness of that is a matter for lawyers, but it's not difficult to see how outsourcing is in effect a transfer of wealth from low-paid women, many of whom are delivering highly valued public services such as social care, to wealthy, mostly male owners or investors in private companies. I would argue that intergenerational social mobility was the biggest driver of the economic growth of the 50s and 60s, and that far from it being a drain on economic well-being, the universalist welfare state was actually in large part an investment in human capital. This investment's lost in a system where safety net provision is rapidly replacing the springboard cradle-to-grave services that were central to that post-war settlement. Despite record spending, all levels of public services report severe demand pressures, as Stephen's been talking about. Overall, Scottish public spending would need to be about £9 billion higher to meet demand for services at 2009-10 service levels. That pressure drives further outsourcing. It also leads to reductions in some service areas in an effort to maintain emergency and reactive services. That means that preventative services are the ones most likely to be cut, which of course only further increases demand for reactive services. This was one of the major conclusions of the Christie Commission report in 2015. It stated that there is no alternative if we do not manage to effect a shift to preventative action. Increasing failure demand will swamp our public services capacity to achieve outcomes. Unfortunately, neither the Christie Commission nor the Public Service Reform Strategy address the glaring problem of how to reinvest in preventative services when savings in reactive provision may not arise for years. Investing in the well-being of preschool children, for example, is undoubtedly the right thing to do to reduce pressure on a range of reactive services, criminal justice, health, children's social work, etc., but it won't happen without an investment strategy based on future savings. Insourcing must also play its part if we're to restore the redistributive springboard ethos of the post-war welfare state and deliver a prosperous, fair and compassionate Scotland. But reinvesting in preventative springboard services is the other vital component of an effective strategy to renew Scotland's public services. That's me, Chair. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. That was a whistle-stop tour of not only Scotland's failure to both invest, to fund, but also to zoom out and look at generational social mobility, which I think is a really good kind of lens to look at this through and say, you know, what do you get for your money when you're investing in in public services, and what does that do for you in terms of your actual welfare and wealth of your whole country? So that was a really good way to look at it. Yeah, thinking about competitive compulsory tendering, I mean, even then the model has shifted so much since then. At that time, we would have been talking about privatisation or moving towards private services being delivered, public services being delivered by private companies that were probably much more localised, a few national companies that were involved in that, but a lot more localised companies as well. And by localised, I maybe mean regional or indeed across just one part of Britain, where now, you know, and it has been the case for certainly the last 20 years and increasingly so, the financialisation model means that that money is going overseas to fewer and fewer larger and larger companies, which is probably was not really in the original plan when they even Thatcher came up with competitive compulsory tendering. So there's been a kind of change in that. You talked about insourcing at the end, and insourcing is one of the areas that we've been thinking a lot about, and obviously the work that you've done and Unison and others on that has been really, really helpful. One of the asks that we've got for the Scottish Government going forward is that an initial step that they need to commit to take is to actually do an audit of outsourced services, because there's nothing like that we know, as you found out trying to pull the research together, exists. So the government itself doesn't even know where local authorities and where other providers are actually, other parts of the public sector are using these services. And we need to look at that if there's going to be, even from the point of view of efficiency or how they could share services. Again, one of the principles of back to the Christie Commission, how can we do that if we don't even know what's being used at the moment? So thank you for that, Andy. And I'll now move on to our final speaker, which is Laurie McFarlane, who's the co-director of Future Economy Scotland. Thanks, Laurie.
Great, thanks, Linda. Hi, everyone. It's really good to be here. So when it comes to protecting and strengthening public services, we really can't avoid addressing the elephant in the room in Scotland, which is funding. And when we can't address funding unless we talk about reforming tax. As Stephen's already said, the Scottish Government's projected a budget gap of just short of 5 billion by the end of the decade. Now, crucially, that budget gap is just to stand still. For the most part, that's just to maintain existing services, which we know are inadequate. And so if we're to not just maintain existing inadequate services, but to go forward and actually strengthen them, there's no doubt that public revenue will need to rise, and it will need to rise in a way which is fairly significant. And of course, we can't do that without undertaking major reform of our tax system. And we've already heard from other speakers, the Scottish Government's plan at the moment is to try and close this gap through various forms of efficiencies, which I think, as Stephen and other speakers have already said, in our view, is really not credible. And so earlier this year, we published our new report called Funding Scotland's Future, where we look at utilising Scotland's devolved fiscal powers as effectively as we can to raise revenue in a way that's fair, that's progressive, and that's efficient, and that's also contributing towards our economic, social and environmental goals. And I've just shared the link to this in the chat if anyone's interested. So I'll just run through very quickly a top level line of where we got to in terms of recommendations on revenue raising. So firstly, income tax, which as the largest revenue raiser in Scotland, it will need to do a decent chunk of the heavy lifting. And while it's really important that when we're reforming income tax, we're doing that in a way which is progressive, with those who are the higher earners paying the most, reality is we aren't going to be able to raise enough if we just tax the very, very highest earners alone. We should be taxing them more, and that's what we propose to do. But there aren't enough of the very high earners to raise sums on the scale needed to close the budget gap, to invest in public services, poverty alleviation, etc. And so the reality is that if we're to maintain the social contract that we have in Scotland and protect and strengthen public services, many of us will need to pay at least a little more tax, while ensuring, of course, that the most vulnerable are protected. And so making sure that those with the broadest shoulders are paying the most, but with a broader based rises across other parts of the distribution in a way that's progressive. And this is the kind of approach that other countries that have very strong public services and lower inequality do, like Scandinavia, other parts of Northern Europe. And so in terms of our proposals, we recommend increasing income tax by 1% on the lowest 3 income tax bands in Scotland, and on 2% on the highest 3 bands, alongside reducing the higher rate threshold to £40,000. Now, in total, we estimate this would raise around £1.5 billion a year after accounting for behavioural changes. And that the distributional impact of that is highly progressive. And if you can see in the report, we model that out in terms of what does that distributional impact look like. And it is the case that those who are the higher earners are doing most of the heavy lifting, although others lower down the income distribution around the middle, etc., will be paying a little bit more. And this, in our view, is really unavoidable if we are to raise funding on the scale needed to deliver on public services, unless the UK government comes in with significantly increases in funding, which I think is unlikely. So the second area we look at is in relation to property. And so firstly, in relation to council tax, which I think by this point, everyone in Scotland nearly agrees that it's deeply unfair and inefficient, and it really has to go in the next parliament. It really can't go on. And so we recommend replacing council tax as well as the land and buildings transaction tax together, replacing that with what we call a progressive property tax. So this is a tax on property wealth based on up-to-date property values, instead of being based on 1991 values as we have with council tax today. And that would be set at 0.75% of property values, up to 400,000, rising to 1% on the portion above 400,000. And that threshold could change. We chose 400,000, but the idea is there's a surcharge on higher value properties. And overall, we estimate this could raise just under £250 million per year in a way that, again, it's highly progressive, improves fairness, and also improves efficiency of the system, given how inefficient council tax is today. And crucially, this is taxing property wealth, and property wealth being the most significant component of wealth in Scotland, which to date has been significantly undertaxed. But property isn't just held by households, of course. There's business property as well. And so we also propose reforming the tax system there. And so today we have the non-domestic rates regime, which has a number of issues in terms of lots of arbitrary reliefs and exemptions. Significantly among that is about 90% of non-domestic land in Scotland is completely exempt from non-domestic rates because forestry land and agriculture are not in the system. And so we propose replacing non-domestic rates with a land value tax set at 2.9% of market value. And what this would do is we widen the tax base by bringing forestry land into the tax system, which, as I said, is currently exempt. Forestry as an industry has been doing very well. It already benefits from various other tax breaks. We don't see why they should be tax exempt, why other businesses shouldn't be. And so overall, while this would take time to implement, there's practical challenges to overcome with a land value tax. Over the medium term, we estimate this could bring in an additional £482 million a year, making a really important contribution to the public finances and public services. We also touch on a number of other areas, which I'll just say very briefly. We have control over the taxation of air passenger travel in Scotland now, and we propose replacing the current air passenger duty with a frequent flyer tax. So under this system, everyone would get one first flight a year with no tax, but then every subsequent flight after that would be taxed at an escalating rate. And this is really to capture the polluter pays principle, where those often on higher incomes are taking the most flights, contributing the most emissions. They should be taxed on that basis to change behaviour in the economy. We also propose a new tax on development. And so this is a tax on the uplift in land value that arises when planning permission is granted, which is often very, very significant, and it accrues straight to the landowner as a windfall. And we estimate with the parameters that we set in the paper, this could raise up to around £75 million a year, depending on how you structure it and what capture rate that you go for. Just finally, just two taxes which we also look at in the report, which is a wealth tax and a carbon tax. Now, there's been quite a lot of discussion around a wealth tax, and we look at a wealth tax and model it out. We find that a 2% tax on wealth over £5 million could raise up to £700 million a year. The issue is just a practical one. Scotland can't unilaterally introduce new taxes at the national level without permission from Westminster, so it would need to be done at a local authority level. And our assessment is trying to introduce that at a local authority level would be extremely challenging in terms of monitoring and enforcing that. And so that we recommend the Scottish Government should be taking this up with the UK Government as part of that wider discussion of wealth taxation across the UK. So overall, the proposals that I just outlined, we estimate would raise just under £2.5 billion a year. And that would go a very long way in terms of addressing these issues with the public finances, providing that vital investment that's very much needed on frontline, whether it's in the NHS, whether it's in schools, or whether it's in other services. And I think that given the challenges in the public finances, this issue is really going to come to the fore in the early stages of the next Parliament. We've got parties proposing quite radical tax cuts. So I think it's really important that that collectively we have credible proposals of how we can actually raise revenue in a way that's fair and efficient. Because if we don't have that, there is a risk that we will see further cuts come down the line. I will stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurie. That was excellent. I know your paper you've shared as well. So there's a lot in all of these. A couple of reflections I had just, about coming up for the election and some of the language that's being used. You referred to it just there about the parties talking about tax cuts. There's always a narrative around everyone's frightened to talk about potentially any tax rises or indeed how they would change. Tax just doesn't appear, it's in the manifestos, but it's not normally in the kind of narrative that we find in the media because nobody wants to talk about tax. So it's even more important that we have an understanding of what can be done and how we fund the things that are associated with the services that we get. And also this narrative around in a couple of speakers mentioned it today, around the public sector workforce and shrinking the workforce and waste in the workforce and how it's kind of seen. I mean, we should be demanding from our politicians that a high number of employment within the public sector is something that country should be proud of, because they're making that investment. You know, I think, Stephen, you brought out some figures there about how it compares to other countries as well. So there's two distinct narratives that we see across politicians, which is, let's not talk about tax, or if we do, it's about tax cuts, and also our public sector isn't something to be proud of. You know, as they play into this idea that therefore it is inefficient. You know, I'll just, before we take further questions, there's a couple that we've got in the chat already. Laurie, maybe just if you can answer, maybe think about them quickly. What could Scottish Government do about the whisky industry, specifically about tax, and is there any mileage there, and also about second homes?
Yeah, so first on the second homes issue. So yeah, absolutely, and we absolutely think there should be quite a hefty surcharge on our progressive property tax in relation to taxing those who whether it's second homes or holiday homes. Has been a huge issue in many parts of the country. There already is a surcharge. I think that could be higher. I think there's other issues, other levers that we need to use in relation to that issue, as well as the tax system, in order to address that. On the whisky industry, so yeah, there was some interesting work done a while ago by, I think it was Bigger Economics, on taxing the whisky industry, and I think it's the right question to ask. I think the question is, practically, how do we do that in a way that's compatible with the powers that we have in Scotland, in a way that is going to do that most effectively? And so it's something that we're thinking about exploring a bit more. My understanding is, this could be wrong, so don't quote me on it, that the Bigger Economics kind of proposed it and then kind of backed away from that proposal. And so I think there's some interesting work to be done in terms of, could we, with the tax levers that we have in Scotland, which are limited, use that in a way to kind of tap into some of that wealth, which of course is built on Scotland's national resources, but which is too often being extracted by the global multinationals who own these companies. So yeah, I think it's something that we're going to be doing a bit more thinking about.
Thanks, Laurie. That was excellent. If anyone's got any questions, we've got time for a couple. They can pop them into the Q&A. One of the things I wanted to ask the panel really was when we talked about insourcing, because it is an area that I think we've seen both explicitly by Andy's research and others, and by talking about the gaps that you've all identified in what we need in public services and where the money is leaking completely out of the system into private hands and into profiteering. How do we go about insourcing? What are the first steps? I mean, we've talked about trying to do an audit as a very first step, but what would any of you see as the first steps that we would need both government to do and potentially local authorities to do to actually go around? And is there any successful models of that you could point to? Anybody got any thoughts on that? Andy? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, we've tended to follow a kind of business case driven model, encouraging local authorities and other public bodies to actually look in detail at the financial case. We know that even where the political will is there, public bodies are going to be very reluctant to increase the cost of services. But what we find is that often the in-house option actually, when you actually do the sums, actually does work out more or less the same, if not actually more cost effective than outsourced services. I mean, the important thing is that point I was making about, particularly in social care, you've got very large amounts of money essentially leaving the public sector, leaving Scotland, leaving the UK in a lot of cases. And in some of the cases where firms are heavily indebted, you're talking up to, say, 28% of revenue going out in the form of various payments that all would be saved were those services to be provided directly by public bodies. And then you've got the benefit to local economies from people being able to spend, better pay and better pensions locally. So the case isn't actually that hard to make. I think what we've got to do is kind of change the mindset away from people thinking that somehow it's a way of saving money. I mean, it just isn't a way of saving money.
Thanks, Andy. Lillian, and then I'll take the next question. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda, and thanks, Andy. Just to add to the contribution that Andy made, I absolutely, totally agree with all of that. I think there's also another dynamic in this in terms of the public health agenda. These are predominantly low-paid women who have been outsourced, who have will see poverty in their pension as well. So there is a lot of issues for us as public sector workers, but also for the bodies that deliver those public services, because those women will be more heavily reliant on public services and more heavily reliant on support from government because of the lack of accrued benefits in terms of their pensions. So there is a broader argument around this as well, but there's also a really strong argument for us to say, even if we look across the health service in Scotland, last year we saw Serco in Forth Valley hospitals look to fire and rehire all those part-time women in that service. Those women took a courageous stand against that employer and brought that employer back to the negotiating table and stopped that fire and rehire. They were looking to put those women on monthly pay. Now, that could have had a catastrophic, devastating effect on those women's pay. And a lot of those workers that deliver that service were two people from the same household. So huge implications for them. But when we organise, my point around the movement is when we organise those women, we organised with Unite and GMB, and we stopped that regressive attack on those women. So we have an obligation in this as well to organise that workforce and make sure that those voices are heard. And fair work should be a fundamental plank in that as well.
Thanks, Lillian. Thank you for that. You're right. Whether it's workers that are directly impacted, but also not only have the better ideas, but also will defend the services themselves. I've got a question here from David Aitchison, which do parties need to be more realistic about the costs associated with a failing housing system and the impact that this is having on the wider public services? It's in the Q&A, and there's a point there from IPPR's previous research. So I'll come to Stephen if that's okay.
Yeah, I think David does quite a good job of answering his own question there, actually. Yeah, I would agree. I think, underinvestment in housing over the longer term is now adding all manner of cost to society that we're struggling to bear. Indeed, I think, one of the main processes we identify in the paper that's adding to the rising costs of delivering public services at the moment is the failure demand that arose from austerity over the last decade, and I think in Scotland, we've not always been very good at thinking about the opportunity cost of various policy measures. So we have some policy measures out there. I would pick on free travel, for instance, something which is absolutely a good thing. But did we at the time, and do we now consider the opportunity cost of those kind of spending vis-a-vis other things? And I think housing has been underappreciated in the public policy discourse in Scotland for a very long time now, and I think we're seeing the consequences of that. David concludes with a question: do you see any proposals coming forward from politicians that would solve these issues? Certainly not in the manifestos we've seen to date. I wouldn't be hugely optimistic that we'll see proposals in forthcoming manifestos that are going to solve any of the issues that David identifies, but we shall see.
Thanks, Stephen. And we've got a question. Andy, did you just want to come in on that quickly?
Well, I just wanted to make the point that we actually now spend more on housing. The public sector spends more on housing than it did before the right to buy came in and before housing stock transfer took place. And the reason we do that is because we've shifted to cash transfers, housing benefit, to enable people to buy housing from private sector landlords, and that is way less efficient than providing people with housing. And one of the critical reforms I think we've got to move forward with is trying to reverse that, so that we're building houses for people to live in rather than giving them money to spend on often very poor quality, overpriced housing in the private sector. I think that's one of the most critical things that we need to do moving forward.
Thanks, Andy. That was a good point to make. There's a question here around from Lewis around council tax reform. Is taxing the individual and not the location, size, value of the property not a fairer way to ensure people pay their fair share according to earnings? Laurie, do you want to talk about that? Often these things are pitted against each other, whether you look at income tax or other individual taxes as opposed to a council or property tax. Is it either or, and is one better? I have a view, but I'd like to hear yours.
Yeah, so at the local level, in practice, we can tax anything we like, near enough. Obviously, at the moment, we've got council tax, which is in theory a tax on property, which is highly ineffective in terms of how regressive it is, how inefficient it is. So there are those who have proposed, for example, local income tax instead of property tax. I think there are very strong reasons for taxing, for having local tax based on property, while also, of course, taxing income more effectively at the national level. If we look at the tax system in this country over recent decades, we have taxes on income, we have taxes on consumption, taxes on wealth, and in my view, wealth has been significantly under-taxed, and huge dividing line in society between those who own assets, own wealth, which is, gone up and up and up, and those who don't. And then particularly in relation to property, which has obviously been the engine of wealth accumulation in this country, has been property prices rising. So there's good fairness arguments for taxing property wealth. There's also good economic arguments for taxing property in terms of being one of the most efficient forms of tax. Unlike other forms of wealth, you can't shift property to the Cayman Islands or offshore. We know where it is; it's fixed. It's a very effective way to tax that. So I think combined with the national level income tax, I do think from a sort of wealth inequality perspective, it's important that we're taxing property far more effectively, and also from a revenue and efficiency standpoint as well. So I don't necessarily think it's an either or. I think a tax system needs to be taxing income, needs to be taxing consumption, also needs to be tackling wealth. And certainly in the context of the devolved levers that we have in Scotland, the area of wealth which we can tax effectively is property. And I think it's important that we use the levers that we've got to do that at the local level.
Thank you, Laurie. I've got a quick question that maybe applies to everyone a little bit, because one of the areas that we're seeing increasingly being discussed and talked about, and it's part of public sector reform potentially, and often is kind of handed out by management in various organisations as saying this is a revelation and a new way forward, which it really isn't. But AI, what role do you see that AI could play if it's done ethically? Or do you think that there isn't really a role for it, and what is such a people-centred services? Anyone want to have a think about that? Andy, yes.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure of the answer to the question, but what I can say is that much of the global investment that's going into social care at the moment, particularly home care, is based on an assumption that actually increasingly people delivering home care are going to be replaced by machines, and particularly by AI. There is no government policy on this. We haven't had the discussion about how we want to see home care develop over the years. We're actually being driven by investors in California, in San Francisco, who own the UK's biggest provider of home care indirectly. As I say, that investment is a gamble on us being willing to see people being replaced by machines. I mean, I really struggle with that, because I think that elderly or more vulnerable people really value and need that human interaction which comes with people delivering home care. We need the discussion. We absolutely need to have that, and we need to have it urgently.
Thanks, Andy. And Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, I strongly agree with that. I mean, I think it would be good, if as part of this election campaign, we heard more politicians drawing a kind of clear line about human delivery of the personal services that the public sector currently provides. I mean, one of the blogs we completed as part of this project looked at the example of radiography in health services. So 10 years ago, Geoffrey Hinton, one of the fathers of AI, said that we should stop training radiographers because AI was already better at image recognition. You wind forward 10 years and radiography, there was a huge demand for services. Currently the best paid health occupation in America, at the bleeding edge of AI adoption. And Why is that? Because AI can only do a small part of what a radiographer does as part of his job, but in reducing the cost of that part of the job, increase the demand for it. So the demand for the other stuff that radiographers do also increases. So I think it's really difficult in public services to identify areas where AI will replace people, and it's only by replacing people that it will save money. So I think hoping that AI is going to ride to the rescue of the fiscal gap that we identified at the start of the conversation, I think, is not particularly serious. But the fact that politicians want to concentrate on it as a constant distraction, it's really unhelpful to the kind of conversation we should be having.
Thank you, Stephen. We're just on 9:30 now. There was a question in the chat as well about further and higher education unions, particularly universities, but I'll answer it about them all. At a local level, there is various arrangements that unions have across campus to deal with the issues that are raised, particularly, as you say, about the underfunding and how that impacts on staff, the precarious nature and job security that there is in higher education. And we've also, across further education, had a huge range of industrial disputes around similar issues as well, and also on pay. So we previously did at the STUC on a national level have a forum for the unions to meet together, and we've actually just brought that back together, and that's a piece of work we'll be continuing after this election, regardless of who the new government is or who the HE and FE minister are, to make sure that unions are involved in further higher education, come together to discuss the issues about sustainability in the sector, but also to make sure that they can support each other when there is disputes. Thank you everyone for attending today, and thanks to our panel. We just scratched the surface. I mean, there was so much in all of your presentations. I'm glad we've got the links to the reports and to the backup information, because it'll give people time to take it away and have a bit further read. I think there's a forum for us to do more of this in the future, really. There's probably something that we need to look at after the election about how we come back together and say, well, what does that mean now, depending on what we end up with as a government. I mean, we're only 4 weeks away from the election. We've shared our manifesto in the link, and we'd ask you to share it with members, to take the asks away from today into the election, and to ask candidates. There is opportunities to lobby, to email your candidates, and to let people know, like this is one of the times where it is a very public. Our last election was held during the pandemic and it was all online. We can get back into rooms with politicians and on a very local level and ask them what their candidates are going to do, how they're going to support public services, how they'll improve public services, and how they're going to make sure, how they'll fund them and make sure that they're delivered properly for our communities and in workers and in youth service users' interests. So thanks to all our panel today, and thank you all for coming along also. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks,
Thank you.